Have you ever wondered if entire chapters of Jesus Christ's life vanished from the official record? Some believe he ventured far beyond the Middle East, studied under unknown teachers, and that Mary, his mother, silently endured hardships after his crucifixion. Traditional historians rarely confront these gaps, but researcher Dolores Cannon used surprising techniques to uncover pieces of a puzzle we never knew existed. Get ready. What follows might challenge everything you thought you knew. There's no denying that the Bible leaves substantial periods of Jesus' life unexplained. We hear about his miraculous birth, a brief moment during his youth in Jerusalem, and then suddenly he reappears as an adult entering ministry. What happened in those intervening years, from age 12 to about 30, remains a source of endless speculation. Why did the disciples seemingly vanish from record after the crucifixion? And what became of Mary, the one who stood faithfully by him in every gospel account? Dolores Cannon, renowned for her hypnotherapy work and past life regression sessions, believed these empty spaces were far from accidental. According to her research, vital elements of Jesus' story may have been deliberately set aside or neglected by those shaping religious orthodoxy over centuries. While some of her ideas sound radical, especially to more traditional believers, Cannon insisted that the missing narratives hold great importance. From her perspective, not only did these intervals illuminate aspects of Jesus' teachings, they also explained how his mother and core disciples faced relentless persecution after his execution. Yet these gaps stretch beyond mere curiosity. If the official record left out substantial events, what else might remain buried or ignored? Over the years, various fragments of ancient documents, references in local folklore, and personal testimonies have hinted at a more extensive tapestry. Perhaps the real story of Jesus and his followers is richer, broader, and more complex than we've been taught. Could it be that the very foundations of the Christian tradition were laid, in part, on undisclosed travels and communities formed outside Israel? In Cannon's view, the institutional church may have decided that some details were too controversial or too difficult to reconcile with established teachings. Indeed, controlling which texts and testimonies survived allowed them to uphold a consistent narrative. For better or worse, that means we have inherited only partial glimpses of what might have been a remarkable spiritual odyssey. What you're about to discover are theories that stretch beyond conventional understandings, glimpses of a side to Jesus' story that resonates powerfully with those seeking answers beyond the mainstream. Dolores Cannon was not your typical religious scholar. Her approach was unconventional, relying on deep hypnosis and regression techniques that purportedly tapped into memories from other lifetimes. While some skeptics question the validity of such sessions, Cannon found enough recurring themes and consistent accounts to pique her curiosity. In these trance states, individuals with no prior connection or shared background described eerily similar scenes. Jesus traveling outside the Mai, Holy Land, interacting with spiritual communities in distant regions and even broadening his own worldview. Over time, Cannon compared these narratives with old manuscripts, obscure references in ancient libraries, and local legends from around the globe. The overlaps she identified were, in her eyes, too frequent to be dismissed as coincidence. Whether one believes in the methodology or not, the sheer volume of parallel stories raised legitimate questions. Why would people from different corners of the world recount matching details regarding Jesus' lost years and the fate of his closest followers? Her presentations provoked intense debate. At times, Cannon was praised for her courage in challenging religious dogma. At other times, she faced accusations of heresy or sensationalism. She claimed her intention was never to undermine anyone's faith, but rather to offer a broader perspective on events that might have been censored or forgotten. With each lecture, she invited audiences to remain open-minded, to read widely, and to form their own conclusions about what might lie in those quiet spaces of the Christian story. Crucially, Cannon's findings didn't stop with Jesus himself. She also delved into lesser-known figures such as Joseph of Arimathea, who often appears only briefly in the canonical Gospels. It was through these peripheral characters that she believed new windows into the earliest Christian communities could be opened. Many accounts portrayed Mary, the disciples, and various supporters fleeing persecution in ways rarely, if ever, mentioned in standard teachings. As the puzzle began to take shape, Cannon became convinced that entire chapters of our religious heritage had gone missing. And yet, even in the face of strong opposition, Dolores stood by the principle that knowledge, no matter how disconcerting or alternative, deserves a chance to be examined. If we only rely on what official narratives present, we risk missing out on pieces of history that might clarify or deepen our understanding. It was this sense of discovery and the promise of a more complete portrait of Jesus and his companions that propelled her forward. But her revelations wouldn't be complete without shining a spotlight on Joseph of Arimathea, who plays a far bigger role than many realize. In mainstream Christian texts, Joseph of Arimathea appears briefly, the wealthy man who offered his own tomb for Jesus' burial. Beyond that, however, details are sparse. Dolores Cannon, along with several other researchers, believe Joseph held an even more critical function in the early Christian story, one that might answer questions about Jesus' missing years and the disciples' fates. Historical fragments and local tales suggest he was involved in a vast maritime trade network, dealing in metals like tin, which led him to frequent journeys across the Mediterranean and beyond. What if these journeys weren't purely commercial? Some accounts indicate that Joseph may have been a relative of Jesus, an uncle or great-uncle depending on the source, and might have taken a young Jesus on voyages to gain exposure to different philosophies. It's theorized that in places like the British Isles, Jesus could have encountered Celtic Druids, known for their profound spiritual and astronomical knowledge. Such an exchange of ideas might explain the blend of themes in Jesus' later teachings, emphasizing love, community, and a deep connection with the spiritual realm. The question of why the Bible makes little mention of Joseph's significance is part of the broader enigma. Could official scribes have decided that describing Jesus' worldly travels detracted from his divine image? Or maybe the focus on Jesus' ministry overshadowed earlier experiences that, while formative, didn't fit neatly into the theological framework that later evolved. In any case, stories abound in regions like Glastonbury, England, where it's said that Joseph established small Christian enclaves long before more formalized churches emerged. Dolores Cannon pointed to these oral histories and wrote about how certain villages in Britain maintain centuries-old traditions of a holy visitation. Likewise, she cited the possibility that Joseph's social and political ties protected early believers from intense persecution, for a time at least. When the political climate changed, he likely had to deploy all his resources to safeguard not just Jesus' teachings, but the individuals closest to him. This pivotal figure, overshadowed in official narratives, might very well have been a hidden pillar supporting the nascent Christian movement. For Cannon, Joseph of Arimathea represented just one thread in a tapestry woven from overlooked sources, suppressed documents, and the living memory of small communities scattered across Europe. But as significant as Joseph was, he wasn't the only one orchestrating remarkable voyages and escapes. According to her findings, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and many disciples were forced to embark on treacherous journeys, redefining the boundaries of early Christian history. One of the boldest claims in Dolores Cannon's work revolves around the idea that Jesus did not remain strictly within the confines of ancient Palestine. Instead, she proposed that he traversed extensive trade routes, possibly venturing as far as England, Gaul, modern-day France, and other territories. Imagine the impact on a young man raised in the Jewish tradition, encountering Celtic rituals, Greek philosophy, or even Eastern spiritual practices along the Silk Road. Such an experience could have enriched his message, turning it into a universal doctrine that transcended regional boundaries. In parts of England, legends endure of a special boy who arrived with a wise patron, sharing ideas about compassion, unity, and the power of the divine. Local lore speaks of him studying with druids, learning about natural remedies, sacred sites, aligned with celestial events, and an openness toward mystical understanding. Whether these tales are literal truth or metaphorical is subject to debate, but they have persisted stubbornly over centuries, often recounted in small towns and rural gatherings. These supposed lost years might clarify why Jesus' teachings resonated beyond the Jewish community. Perhaps he discovered philosophical parallels in Stoicism or encountered spiritual traditions that expanded his own perspective on the divine. Consider the emphasis on universal love, a concept that appears in multiple belief systems. Could it be that Jesus absorbed and harmonized diverse teachings, later presenting them in a form accessible to the local people back in Judea? Naturally, such theories encounter pushback. Traditional theology maintains that Jesus' mission was fulfilled entirely within the biblical lands, shaped by Jewish culture and prophecy. Cannon acknowledged that her ideas challenged long-held assumptions, but she saw them as complementary. If Jesus was truly the teacher of all humankind, wouldn't it make sense that his experiences were broader than we realize? Regardless of which side you lean toward, these narratives ignite a spark of possibility. They invite us to wonder how many influences contributed to the message that would eventually change the world. Still, Cannon's research extended beyond Jesus himself, exploring what happened once his earthly ministry ended and his followers were suddenly thrust into dangerous territory. According to various accounts, Mary and the disciples faced dire threats and made heroic escapes that remain largely unmentioned in the established biblical canon. After the crucifixion, the Gospels mention a few post-resurrection appearances, but the fate of Jesus' closest companions becomes far murkier. Dolores Cannon's gathered accounts describe an atmosphere of fear. Roman authorities, along with certain religious leaders, perceived Mary, the disciples, and other devout followers as a menace that needed to be neutralized. Publicly executing them, however, risked inciting revolt among the people. A more discreet method, according to these narratives, was to load them onto ships bereft of adequate supplies, casting them into open waters to face almost certain doom. It was a grim strategy. The sea itself would carry out the sentence, and those in power would keep their hands seemingly clean. Yet, against all odds, some of these boats reportedly reached distant shores. Locations in southern France, in particular, hold legends of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and others arriving under miraculous circumstances. Villagers along the coast still celebrate stories that speak of the three Marys landing in their region, seeking refuge and ultimately spreading a distinctive Christian ethos. Dolores Cannon found that certain pockets of folk tradition across France, Spain, and possibly Britain maintain age-old celebrations commemorating what they claim were the arrivals of these early Christian figures. Though official history tends to overlook these local festivals, the communities themselves hold them as cherished truths. Historical records might be scarce, but the oral tradition keeps these accounts alive, passing them from one generation to the next. The notion that Mary, the mother of Jesus, spent her later years outside the Holy Land can seem startling, yet it resonates with the overall theme of Cannon's work. A Christian story branching far beyond the confines of the New Testament. If these fleeing disciples established tiny enclaves in remote places, they could have quietly nurtured the teachings of Jesus. Over time, these enclaves might have evolved into small gatherings described by different names, whether they called it a church assembly or simply the Way. It's a perspective that reframes early Christian expansion not as a solely Roman or Mediterranean affair, but as a broader phenomenon shaped by individuals forced to survive on distant shores. Once settled in safer lands, Mary, Joseph of Arimathea, and numerous disciples are said to have established rudimentary fellowships, places where people could gather to pray, exchange spiritual ideas, and practice healing arts. Unlike the formalized church structure that would emerge centuries later, these groups were allegedly more egalitarian. They valued open dialogue about spiritual truth, often referring to themselves simply as the Way, inspired by Jesus' core message of love and community. In England, stories about Glastonbury hold that Joseph of Arimathea laid the foundation for what some call the first Christian sanctuary. It didn't resemble a grand cathedral or a heavily supervised institution. Instead, it felt more like a spiritual center, open to all who sought a deeper connection. Some local legends imply that Mary, having narrowly escaped danger in Palestine, found eventual peace among those friendly shores. Whether or not she remained there for the rest of her life is debated, but these narratives contribute to Glastonbury's reputation as a mystical place steeped in Christian lore. Similarly, in southern France, there are accounts of Mary Magdalene and others nurturing early Christian cells, blending the new teachings with local culture and traditions. Instead of a top-down hierarchy, participants in these communities often shared knowledge collectively, reflecting the open style that Jesus reportedly encouraged during his own gatherings. This approach, where everyone could contribute, might have clashed with the more centralized model of church governance that developed in later centuries. Before moving on, here's a brief request. If you're enjoying this content and appreciate the insights, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to go even further in supporting our work, consider sending a super thank you. It truly helps us continue bringing intriguing discoveries to light. Join this amazing community and stay updated on stories others might prefer to keep hidden. The notion of forgotten communities leads to questions. Why did mainstream institutions seldom acknowledge them? According to Dolores Cannon's investigations, these loosely organized fellowships posed a challenge to the notion of a unified, authority-driven church. Over time, official bodies may have sought to integrate or suppress such groups to maintain religious uniformity. Records that confirmed their existence could have been lost, destroyed, or simply discredited. Yet, rumors persist that in remote villages or hidden valleys, the spirit of the way lived on, quietly passing teachings that diverged from standard doctrine. No figure is more emblematic of these alternative narratives than Mary Magdalene. Too often reduced in popular culture to a repentant sinner, Mary Magdalene emerges in Dolores Cannon's research as a pivotal disciple with profound spiritual knowledge. Some even argue she was trained in esoteric traditions, possibly in Egypt, where she might have gained insight into subjects like trance states, meditation, and the sacred feminine principle. Such an educational background would have made her a respected teacher in the eyes of those early communities, forging their path far from Jerusalem. Why then has Mary Magdalene historically been sidelined or misunderstood in mainstream teachings? One hypothesis is that the early church, led predominantly by male authorities, found the idea of a female spiritual leader problematic. Over centuries, the narrative around Mary Magdalene was reshaped, marginalizing her authority and diminishing her contributions. Cannon's writings suggest that if we restore her rightful place, we uncover a far richer tapestry of early Christian spirituality, one that celebrates both men and women as integral messengers of Jesus' lessons. In France, legends claim Mary Magdalene arrived on a boat with other fugitives. Locals say she became a beacon of faith, performing healings and sharing hidden wisdom gleaned from her time with Christ. It's said she taught about inner transformation, direct communion with the divine, and a holistic approach to faith that included compassion, service, and personal responsibility. Some historians and theologians remain skeptical, but the persistence of these stories is notable. Pilgrims still travel to places like Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer in southern France, drawn by rumors of her presence centuries ago. Through her regression sessions, Cannon uncovered tales of Mary Magdalene not simply preaching, but helping form small pockets of believers open to mysticism, communities that aim to live Jesus' teachings in daily practice. This contrasts sharply with the structured orthodoxy that would later take shape. The bigger question is whether these spiritual enclaves influenced the evolution of Christian thought and practice beyond the oversight of Rome or other centralized powers. Mary Magdalene's mysterious journeys remind us that faith traditions often develop in unexpected ways, shaped by people whose stories aren't always officially recorded. Given such a wide array of theories, it's only natural that Dolores Cannon's work has stirred passionate responses. To some, her discoveries enrich their devotion, painting a panorama in which Jesus' teachings permeated multiple cultures, saving countless followers from oppression, and even sending them to distant shores. To others, these accounts are mere speculation, lacking concrete documentary proof. Yet the fact remains that we possess scant definitive records from the first Century and many of the existing documents went through layers of editorial control over time. Critics often argue that local legends and past life regressions can't stand as historical evidence. Supporters, on the other hand, counter that the patterns and correlations found in Cannon's data point to greater truths, concealed not necessarily through malice, but through the historical processes that favored certain narratives over others. Indeed, religion and politics have intersected for millennia, with various councils deciding what was acceptable or heretical. Could it be that some glimpses of Jesus' real journey were considered too unconventional to survive in the official record? Ultimately, Cannon urged readers and listeners to keep an open mind, to not surrender their judgment, and to research beyond the usual boundaries. Whether or not you believe Jesus traveled with Joseph of Arimathea, or that Mary Magdalene became a teacher in France, these possibilities highlight the rich tapestry of traditions, folklore, and personal faith that have developed around the figure of Christ. In many ways, investigating these claims isn't about disproving the Bible. It's about recognizing that history is often more layered than we expect. Perhaps the enduring message here is curiosity, the willingness to challenge our own assumptions and to explore alternative accounts. If Jesus represented universal compassion, then maybe his story truly spanned vast territories and involved individuals whose contributions remain largely unseen. By looking past official versions, we open ourselves up to a vibrant landscape of belief, one in which Mary, Joseph of Arimathea, and other disciples continued to shape communities even after the final pages of the Gospels. And if there's one conclusion we can draw, it's that the hunger for a deeper understanding of these events shows no sign of fading anytime soon. We've reached the end of this immersive exploration into the lesser-known sides of Jesus' life and the fate of his closest followers. Dolores Cannon's work invites us to consider that faith, history, and human resilience intertwine in ways we may never fully grasp. Rather than undermining belief, these theories can broaden our perspective and encourage us to seek out our own answers. If this account resonated with you, keep asking questions, stay curious, and remember, there's always more than one way to discover the truth.